Welcome to episode 17 of CarmelCast, a production of the Institute of Carmelite Studies Publications. You can visit our website at icspublications.org, where right now we have a Lenten promotion going on. All of the writings of St. Thérèse and commentaries about her life, contemporary commentaries on sale for you. Check out our website to see more details, icspublications.org. My name is Brother Pier Giorgio of Christ the King. I work at ICS Publications as an editor. I'm joined today on either side of me by
Brother John Mary of Jesus Crucified.
And Father Michael Joseph of St. Therese.
Great. So one thing that I did last time that I liked, even though it was awkward and difficult for you, put on the spot.
That's why you liked it.
Exactly, yeah. I'm gonna ask you my pop question, right?
Okay.
So this week's pop question is, what misconception about Saint Therese aggravates you or annoys you the most?
That is a great question.
You have to go first.
I gotta
That way
go
I
first?
can
Oh,
think.
man.
You think more on the spot than I do.
All right. Well, I think there's several, but my I guess maybe the most is one that I would hear in seminary sometimes. And there was a seminarian who liked Therese a lot. He loved her. I mean, he attributed a lot to her, but he said, "Oh, but when she was a kid, she was a spoiled brat." And you hear that sometimes. She was a spoiled brat, and it's when you read her life, it's like, no, she wasn't. Like, she struggled with oversensitivity, and she did have certain emotional kind of tendencies to cry or things like that. But and her sister surrounded her with love. Her dad, surrounded her with love, but they were so careful to keep her, from being all about herself, and definitely made sure to make sure she has permission for things, to not just let her get her way. Her dad on a couple instances, was very clear when she was just like expected his affection in a sense, or took it for granted, that he upbraided her for that, and so she was very well formed in that sense, even though a lot was centered on her. I would say she is not a spoiled brat, and I think that's an annoying thing to me when I hear that. So
Yeah, that's good. I think for me, this is maybe a little cliche, but I the misconception that I don't like is that Therese is just very flowery.
That was
and
mine.
and sort of that her spirituality is just this very easy sort of childish kind of way. And that's just to totally misunderstand Therese and her message. Especially, I find if you read her last conversations, which is the accounts of the things that she said during her illness towards the end of her life, which I think we'll talk about in a later episode, you see how her spirituality is so it's difficult. It's a mature spirituality to be able to practice the little way. It's not just some sort of childish little, just happy sunshine and flowers all the time. It's really, it's difficult. And this, what we talked about this earlier, is that it resonates so much with Carmelites, is that it is a way, just like John of the Cross, that's a way of complete renunciation, mortification. But it's a mortification that's interior, an interior mortification of our wills. And that is not easy at all.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Well, I'll go off on a spin-off on that, I guess. And my least favorite misconception, or the one that annoys me the most, is that Saint Therese is a girly saint, right? So you get that sense like that she's like the Lisa Frank of do you remember Lisa Frank, that they made like binders and like stickers and stuff for kids, like girls? So there's like this misconception she's like the Lisa Frank of the Carmelite saints, and I completely reject that from experience, because there's never been a time where I've recommended Story of a Soul to men, to young men and older men, where they haven't come away with a profound sort of and deep appreciation for her spirituality and for her message. So that's my rejection of the Lisa Frank stereotype of Saint Therese.
We gotta copyright that phrase.
Yeah, I don't know if we can. Are we allowed to say like copyright, trademarked things on here? But anyway, so this week, Brother John Mary, you're going to lead us through our discussion on from the point of Thérèse's the Christmas grace, the Christmas conversion, through her entrance into Carmel, and maybe the first days of her life as a Carmelite nun.
Yeah, no, I think this is kind of it covers mainly chapters 5 and 6, I think, of Story of the Soul. But since we're going to be talking about her discernment, really, I mean, it goes way back to kind of the very beginnings of her life, even to talk about that call that she felt. So I guess I just start with a question to you guys, like, where do you kind of see the beginnings of her call to Carmel? Mm-hmm. Maybe not even in a really explicit way, but what was it that was drawing her there?
Yeah. Well, I think, even looking back to when she was a very young child, even I think it was one of her first memories was this desire to be a nun, and she must have heard it, right? When you're the youngest, you have all your older siblings talking about stuff and you get stuff, but she just had this deep sense that she wanted to be a nun. And then and we talked about this episode before, when Pauline was entering, Thérèse kind of thought they had this agreement that they would both go together, and even though she was so young, she had such a mature sense of a call, and so really you see it like from a very early age, this mysterious kind of draw that she had towards the consecrated life.
Yeah, I would point to maybe her first sort of realization that she had some growing to do would have been when she received First Communion and she was on retreat. Yeah. And she said, I'm still in swaddling clothes, or something to that effect. I can't remember the exact quote, but the recognition that she, in the face of experiencing other children who seemed, be able to take care of themselves, comb their hair, brush their hair and things like that. And she had that done for her, her entire life, and she recognized that this was a huge area of growth for her. And I think for the first time, it put in a conscious way for her that if she were to become a nun, like being a religious means a lot of things, among them a renunciation of will and willfulness in a general way, and in specific ways as well, but also a constant commitment to personal growth and growth in your relationship with God and the spiritual life. So I think that really was the first recognition for her that she had imperfections that she had to overcome in order to become a nun, and she attributes that miracle on Christmas with sort of the grace that she was able to receive to overcome that imperfection of sensitivity, hypersensitivity.
Yeah, we read that the account of her Christmas miracle on the last episode, and we just mentioned how really that had a great effect on her discernment and kind of sealed her discernment, her vocation to Carmel. I just find it so interesting that she calls this the greatest grace of her life, and we refer to it as the Christmas miracle. And when you read it, it's interesting to think like, well, just what's miraculous about this, right? Because she experienced, a statue of the Blessed Virgin smiling at her. And later in life, she may have experienced some mystical graces. And yet it was this moment, like, where she just, all you see from an outside point of view is like a girl who decides not to cry. Yeah. And yet that is the greatest miracle of her life. Yeah. And really is what brought her into adulthood, really. In her discernment.
Well, and it's interesting. Blessed Marie Eugene, who was a great lover of Saint Thérèse, great Carmelite, just beatified. He actually says this was the beginning of the little way. When certain authors talk about it at certain points in her life in Carmel, but he says it goes to this, and he called it the night of light. I think she calls it that, the night of light. So you can see this connection too with that God's grace manifesting itself through such ordinary way, and that so bound up with her call to Carmel, with her own spiritual path. Mm-hmm. I love the part at the end where he said, the work I'd been unable to do in 10 years was done by Jesus in one instant, contenting himself with my goodwill, which was never lacking. So getting to the essence of the little way, that the goal is not some success that you measure out for yourself. The goal is the effort. The goal is striving with the pure trust that Jesus is the one who will do it. And I think so. It's just cool how everything about her kind of future path, you can see sort of boiled down into this one moment in a sense.
Yeah. So Thérèse would have, she experienced this Christmas miracle when she was 14 years old. And she enters Carmel a year and a half later. So things really begin to kind of take off after this in her discernment. And she, pretty shortly after receiving this grace on Christmas, decides that she wants to become a Carmelite. And so this is when she begins working towards that. Granted, like we said, she's only 14 years old. So at the time, you had to be 16 in order to enter the convent. And so she still had a long path ahead of her of getting the permissions that she needed. But do you guys remember at all about how particularly her family kind of responded to her desire to enter Carmel at such a young age?
Mm-hmm.
Well, I think there was it was met with, some skepticism on the part of her sisters, just in the sense that, this would take a lot of energy and, lots of permissions and things like that, to go against what was the standard at that time. And even so, the idea of entering at 16, while it was permissible, it wasn't necessarily the norm, right? Yeah. So I think in that sense, Thérèse had to be challenged, and her vocation had to be challenged and tempered, right, in order to determine if it was genuine. On the other hand, though, I think her sisters knew her very well, and certainly Pauline knew that Thérèse had a vocation. Her father, I think, had that intuition as well, that this was Thérèse's path. So it was sort of a supportive aspect in her immediate family. There was resistance with her uncle, her mother's brother, Isidore, and he thought that the whole thing was ridiculous. This idea of someone entering so young.
Yeah, I think he said you can enter when you're 21.
Yeah.
It's like, that's
which is like
consoling.
an eternity
Yeah,
for a 14-year-old.
Yeah. Yeah. So Isidore held up some resistance, but eventually came around. Once he was able to ascertain and discern that the vocation was genuine.
Yeah.
So yeah, and Thérèse had overcome a lot of roadblocks outside of her family as well in terms of the ecclesiastical support and permissions. So there's nothing, the test of vocation is very important because it purifies you as well of misconceptions about what religious life is all about. Mm-hmm. And people want to make sure that you're entering for the right reasons.
Yeah.
Yeah, so after Thérèse gets then the permission, kind of the support of her family, she's now got the permission of her sisters and her father and even her uncle, who originally was opposed. And she just kind of handed it over to the Lord and just said, Jesus, you have to perform a miracle so that my uncle will support me. Yeah. And sure enough, he came around. I think it was like 2 weeks. It's funny because if you read it, Thérèse writes in, I think, Story of a Soul about how a long time passed or something like that. And it was like, there's a footnote. It's like it was 2 weeks later, but it seemed like an eternity to her. So yeah, she's got then the permission. So like, what's the next step then for her?
Yeah. Well, and this is similar with anyone's discernment in the sense like you have the personal aspect first, and the family, of course, is part of that because they know you so well. But then the church has to say yes too, and that's a huge part. You have to have the kind of subjective, confirmation and objective confirmations through the church, at least the official kind of representatives of the church. And so then it's kind of going up the ecclesiastical ladder to get these, required permissions. And a little background too, just to say, it was a very anti-Catholic time in that moment in France, and there was a lot of tension between the civil government and the church, and a lot was going on. So there was a real fear. Even the uncle, one of his reasons that he was resisting was because he thought it would bring scandal, like in a sense that it would publicize who's this little child that they're entering the strictest convent in the church, and what that might do, especially if she didn't persevere and all these, that it could become like a thing, in the press. So that was in the mind, I think, too, of the superiors, in the church, like the ecclesiastical superiors. They didn't want anything that would kind of strike people as really strange or backwards in terms of the way the church was proceeding, so, but as you said, God kind of used that to purify her intentions. So the next one would be the kind of ecclesiastical superior of the Carmel, who is in charge, and he basically just had no time for this request, and maybe he had seen a lot, who knows, maybe he'd seen other younger people or something, I don't know, but and didn't work out, but he just didn't have any confidence that this was legit. So
I think we can get the impression in this process, especially with the ecclesiastical leaders, that they were kind of just these mean old men who were opposing Thérèse, to enter Carmel, which is God's will. But the truth is, I mean, what would we say now about a 14-year-old wanting to commit her entire life in a convent? We'd say, no, wait, wait till you've matured. So I think it's totally reasonable that they resisted this, and yet we can see that it was God's will, because as we continue on this process, eventually it came to be in rather kind of almost miraculous sort of way.
And not to overlook also aspects that this sort of delay allowed Thérèse to really, from the grace of that conversion, to really practice that on a daily basis, in terms of mortifications in maybe not the formal sense, but resignation to the will of God and to His time and how this work would be accomplished. And she also took advantage of the time in the sense that this was really a time of deep study for her. I mean, she spent hours at a time studying science and history, and also used the time to practice what she considered to be sort of the first blossoms of her charism of prayer, and praying for the convicted man for his conversion. What was his name? Pranzini. Yeah. And this sort of being a personal project for her, that he would seek reconciliation before his execution. So these different aspects of part of her life, she during this time she really blossomed and was able to foreshadow a lot of what her life in Carmel would be like, even outside of the convent walls.
So Thérèse experiences the kind of the refusal, pretty strong refusal of the superior of the Carmel, and so her next step then is, well, if I go to the bishop and he gives me permission, then the superior will have to let me. And you can see how her family was very supportive on board, because her father goes off with her. They go to visit the bishop. What was that experience like for her?
Yeah. Well, it's one of those times in reading stories so where you kind of laugh out loud, because she said, here she is in this, colorful dress, trying to put her hair up so she looks older and doing all she can to have some gravitas, and then it's like, it's raining, right? So it's raining super hard. So she's getting wet as they're, approaching the cathedral. And then when they get in there to wait, there's a funeral going on, and so everyone's in black. It's just a very morning. And here's this young girl, this bright dress, trying to work her way through to get to, where she needs to meet with the bishop. And so just the embarrassment, she didn't like to be kind of noticed in a sense. And so it already began this embarrassing moment, to kind of prepare her for, again, it's like these little crosses, seemingly little crosses, but that are a big part of, the vocational journey.
And then she enters the room where she's meeting with the bishop, and there's these three huge armchairs, and she has to sit in one of the armchairs. And again, she put up her hair, so she's trying to look very old. And she said she sits in the chair, and four of her could fit in the chair. You can just see it. There's the bishop kind of looking very, big and powerful, and here she is just feeling like a little girl when she's trying so hard to project this sense of maturity and adult.
Yes. And despite all of her best measures to sort of not trick the bishop, but to sort of present her best self in terms of being able and mature enough to enter Carmel, the bishop ultimately says, "Well, I'll have to check with Father de la Troette, who was the one who was completely against it, the ecclesiastical superior." So it's like the whole plan is foiled, and she has to kind of start from square one. So
the bishop doesn't give his permission, and Thérèse, again, she's trying to act all mature, and she starts crying. This is what she can now always control those emotions, and you think this is the worst thing to do if you're trying to convince him that you're an adult. But it turns out he has great compassion on her. He ends up, I think, kind of embracing her and trying to console her, and he says, well, basically that he'll see what he can do, and that he'll let her know, because the next thing is their family was planning on joining this pilgrimage to go to Rome, And so the bishop tells her that after the pilgrimage, he would give kind of his answer. So they basically go from there. They go on this pilgrimage to Rome. And what was that experience like for Thérèse?
Well, before she got to Rome, they spent some time in Paris, and that was for Thérèse, that was an important period or time. Only a few days, but she speaks about the Church of Our Lady of Victory in Paris, and I guess during the time where she was having her great illness, when she was younger, there was a novena of masses offered for her at this church. So she wanted to pay a pious visit to the church where where she attributed her healing from at the hands of Our Lady. And this was another sort of instance where you see her spiritual maturity during this time of trial and tempering of her desires in terms of making sure they're genuine. And eventually they make their way to Rome. And this is during a period where there was a lot of anti-Catholicism going on in both France and Italy. So you can only imagine some of the experiences that she would have had in the midst of protests and things like that. And she mentions a few of those instances, but it would have been, she speaks of this time as she's very, she sees herself as very impressionable. And she understands that she has to keep her guard up in order to not be tempted into sin amidst people screaming at you in the midst of a city life. You can only imagine what that would have been like. So there is this sense where she's really practicing the reception of the grace that she received and really using it in a sense, and allowing God, this resignation to allow God to be the master of her life.
Exactly. And I think you can see how that kind of tied into her really sense of Marian consecration in that moment, because when she went to France and she went to Our Lady of Victories, it was a realization for her, because as we talked about the healing that she received, right after that, the sisters in Carmel sort of tricked her in a way to telling, or that's, maybe a too extreme way to saying of what happened. She didn't want to say what happened. And once she told it, she just was agonized over, did it really happen? Or was I, did I say this? I shouldn't have said it. And for years she struggled. She was haunted by this beautiful grace she received, and then what she had maybe done to mess it up. And when she went to Our Lady of Victories, whatever that connection with Our Lady in that moment was, just made her know for certain that Our Lady healed her, that it was all good, and so it was a real moment for that. And then it's like Thérèse just receives this peace, and then in gratitude entrusts everything to Mary. So it's a real sense too of her vocational journey is being entrusted to Mary in this moment, and then also her pilgrimage to Rome, that Mary will protect her, keep her pure, and because things happen, not only the kind of the rabble, this pilgrimage was famous. Actually, it was in the press, and so these Italians heard about this French group coming to, wish the Pope a happy 50th anniversary, basically, of his priesthood. And so these French people would line up when the train, because they knew where the pilgrimage was going. So, and at one point, all these, kind of young men who were interested in seeing some young French girls were waiting at the train station. And here comes Thérèse and Celine. And one of these Italian guys comes and just hugs Thérèse and snatches her up, And
Thérèse just gave him this look.
Thérèse just gave this look, right?
And he backed off.
So she had, Our Lady, that consecration was really bearing fruit,
So we see then, I don't think we get this impression as much from reading Story of a Soul as when you kind of dig into the letters of Thérèse, but even before this pilgrimage, she has a plan in mind for her discernment. And it's not just something that she has planned, but it's like her whole family is involved in what's going to happen in Rome. And what is she planning?
Well, she knows that there's going to be an opportunity during the papal audience that the pilgrimage will have. They're there to wish him a happy ordination anniversary. So she devises this plan with her accomplice Celine who's with her on the pilgrimage, to ask the Pope, the Holy Father, Pope Leo XIII, for permission to enter the Carmel, because she knows that if the Pope says yes, well then nothing else can stand in her way. He's the buck stops with him.
Right. So she didn't get permission from the superior, didn't get permission from the bishop. So the next step is the Pope, and it wasn't like this was just some quick decision that she made. Even before this pilgrimage, her whole family's involved. Did you see in the letters? Her sisters who were in the Carmel are writing to her, telling her, because I guess before she had left, she had this idea. It was Thérèse's initial idea to speak to the Pope, and they told her no, not to do it, because it wouldn't be very prudent. But eventually they kind of came around and changed their minds. So then they're writing to Thérèse while she's on this pilgrimage and saying, you should speak freely with the Holy Father, and here's what you should say. And so even her father's involved, and one of her cousins, they're all involved in this plan. And then the day comes.
And she's super nervous, of course, and I just think too, a girl who struggles with timidity, is very shy, and doesn't want to be noticed, right? And then she has, because everyone has their chance to greet the Pope, in this pilgrimage group, and no one's supposed to say anything, so she has to go out of her way to say and do what no one else is even doing, and explain her cause, in this 5 seconds that she has. And so I just can't imagine. And so her heart's just pounding. And this is where I love Celine, because Thérèse is having second thoughts, and she's right about to meet the Pope, and she turns to Celine, and Celine just says, speak, just do it, and it gave her the animo to then present, her case before the Holy Father.
And also when she's going up there, she sees that the Vicar General is standing right next to the Holy Father, and he already knows the whole situation with her wanting to enter Carmel. So she said when she saw him there, her heart just sank, because she knew that everything that she said, he was going to be right there to hear the entire thing.
Yeah, and it's funny too, because right up into this, right before this whole vignette sort of begins, they'd actually told all the pilgrims that there wouldn't be time for talking because they were running behind schedule. So they strictly said, just kiss his hand, kiss his ring, and move on. So to see the Vicar General standing right there, and knowing that Thérèse was going to have to disobey his instruction, we'll say instruction, about what you could do in front of the Pope, it must have been, her heart must have been pounding the whole time.
Yeah, I can't imagine.
Yeah. So she approaches the Pope, she kisses his slipper. And then she looks up at him, and she basically makes her case in a short sentence. She says that she would like his permission to enter Carmel at age 15. And what was his response?
It's like you would imagine, here's this Pope, meeting all these new people and just going on, and then here's this little girl, and he's just like, what? He just couldn't comprehend in that moment what she was asking him, and then the Vicar General was Holy Father, here's a young girl who's 15 who wants to enter Carmel, and he's like, we'll do what the superiors tell you, it's the last thing she wanted to hear.
Right, and then Thérèse, rather than just taking that, right, and just accepting it, it says that she says that she put her hands on his knees, and she just begs him. She says, but if you give permission, then no one can say no. And that's when he says, just do what that's when he says, if it's God's will, you will enter.
Yes.
So what is Thérèse's initial reaction then? So all this happens, she's basically, the guards come and kind of tell her it's time to go. They kind of help her get up and walk her away. And so what's Thérèse's initial reaction to this whole experience?
Well, I just say, it was complete dejection. She just felt like it was as a total failure, total what they say, dumpster fire. Nothing went according to plan, and it's funny, even in the letters, years later, she's already in Carmel. And when Celine talks about it, it's almost like still there's almost a trauma there, because the disappointment was so strong. But she was able to kind of recompose herself. And just a little vignette, later on, one of the guards who took her away, maybe 50 years later, his daughter was around in a convent, some convent when Thérèse was canonized. And when she learned the story, she realized her father came home that day and said, "It was a great day. You wouldn't believe it though. There was this young girl who wanted to enter Carmel at a young age and et cetera, et cetera." And so it just, it struck this guy so much. And then this daughter remembered that her whole life, all these years later. So I think it had a bigger impact on others than she had thought. And even the vicar general, it did something to move his heart, even though he was annoyed clearly that she did this, but it planted something in his heart. And you wonder, even with the Pope, you wonder if it made more of an impact than, so she didn't know all this, but her sincerity and her genuineness was making an impact on people, in that moment, and already starting the motions and for it all to end up working out.
Yeah. And she wanted to recompose herself in a sense as well, because I think to some extent she did realize that, she still had work to do, right? So the remainder of the pilgrimage, she was sort of trying to get into the graces of the superiors who were present, the bishop and the vicar general, to really demonstrate, okay, I am mature, I can handle disappointment, and I can show them, right,
yeah.
that this really is what, if it is God's will, I'll show them that it's God's will,
Yeah.
because I'll show them how mature I am and how I'm able to handle this bad news,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Yep. Exactly.
Yeah, and so at first she's like totally, like you said, just dejected about this whole experience. But then we see a little change happen. Actually, just a few days later, she gets some letters from her sisters in Carmel, from Pauline and from Marie. And it seems like they really helped her to kind of change her mindset, because they point out, well, you should rejoice in this because look what the Pope told you. He said, if it's God's will, you will enter.
Mm-hmm.
And it's very clearly God's will. So you should take this as not as a rejection, but this is a great grace, actually, in prophetic words from the Pope. And this is where we see very strongly in the letters, they start between Thérèse and her sisters, this idea of Thérèse being this sort of the little ball.
Mm-hmm.
It comes out a lot. Can you say a little bit about that kind of aspect of her spirituality?
Oh yeah, just the sense of what being the child Jesus' toy, and just to kind of like do whatever he wants with, and not to have any demands on what he should be doing or how things should go, but that even if he wants this, she says like, pierce it and tear it open, because that's how she felt. That's okay, he can do what he wants. And so that real abandonment, to divine providence, you can see, in that, in this. And again, as you mentioned, like helping form her spirituality, because it was only in this pilgrimage too, and I don't know if I'm jumping ahead, but it was only in a pilgrimage that she met all these priests for the first time. Mm-hmm. And by being around them all the time, she saw that these are very, fragile human beings who need prayer, and there were certain instances where I think one, she really liked the hot chocolate drink at the inn, and I guess this one priest would always like drink it all ahead of time. So this priest wasn't the model of mortification maybe that she thought a priest would be. And these little things, helped her see, her part of her call to pray for priests, in Carmel. So just kind of that getting worked into in this whole journey through Rome.
Right.
And to show a little bit of maybe an insight into her similarity with her namesake, Saint Thérèse of Avila, her determination in all of this. I think this would have been a lesson for her in determination, in the sense that she, at this point, she has gotten as high as she can, to the highest court in the land, so to speak, in terms of what she can do, what she can accomplish. And I think there would have been a sense of peace for her. I think she even speaks about this, that she had done all that she could. Mm-hmm. And to as an example of what determination in the spiritual life looks like, if discerning that something's God's will, to be determined to see it to its end as much as we can.
Yeah, and going back to that image of her being Jesus's little ball, his plaything, it's a beautiful sense of abandonment and docility, but it doesn't mean for Thérèse that we don't do anything, because she went all the way to the Pope. So like you said, she did everything that she could, and yet then you just hand it over and just trust and say, if it's your will, God, then it'll happen. I've done all that I can.
Yeah.
Now it's in your hands.
Yes.
And it's just like such a beautiful aspect of her spirituality to be able to hand that over in that way.
Yeah. And that's a real peace, you know, there's an unshakable peace that she would talk about that she had deep down, you know, as a fruit of that.
And she didn't give up hope. She still is convinced that she's going to enter at Christmas. This is November.
Yeah.
And she's still convinced that she's going to enter the Carmel at Christmas. And so we see even on the rest of her pilgrimage, things kind of change even a little bit more. Her father talks with the vicar general. She has this moment where she's left somewhere where there's only one carriage left, and it's the vicar general's carriage. And so it's this great, you know, you can just imagine her climbing up, and she's sitting with him in this carriage and speaking a little bit with him. But so she begins she goes through these ups and downs of having hope that this is still going to happen. It's still God's will. And that continues through the rest of this pilgrimage.
Yeah. And then she gets home eventually. And, you know, the ecclesiastical superior of the Carmel Father del Tourette, he's still, you know, he's as, you know, as, you know, obstinate as he's always been in this regard. But she must have had some effect on the vicar general and the bishop, because ultimately the bishop gives her permission and says, okay, you can enter the Carmel of Lisieux.
Yeah. And that all comes particularly through a letter. She writes this letter to the bishop, and eventually he responds. But it says when she wrote the letter, I think it was 10 days before Christmas, she was still thinking she's going to enter at Christmas. And it says every day after Mass, she would go with her father to the post office and just see that there wasn't this letter that she was expecting. Yeah. And so this is another great lesson in detachment. Is every day she's going and she's still holding out hope that it's going to be. But then Christmas comes and goes, and she still hasn't heard yet.
Yeah. And it doesn't mean too that she just was like willful, like she just decided Christmas. Like she probably had, you know, some real sense, even by God, you know, that this would happen, and so she was holding on to it. But that it shows too that freedom of being able to revise, in a sense, your expectations of what God is doing based on the reality, you know, and not giving up hope, but saying, okay, maybe it's not precisely at Christmas, but then a week after Christmas, the letter does come, you know. So it just, for whatever reason, she maybe just needed to let go of even what she thought God was telling her or wanted, you know, in that moment.
And I think you know, a lot of times we have a tendency, a lot of people have a tendency, I know I do, of like wanting to see, you know, Providence sort of realize, like, well, this will be the 1 year anniversary of all of these things. I do that all the time. I was made an acolyte on the Feast of Christ the King, which is my feast day, and you know, I want all of these things to sort of work out in this sort of way. My second novitiate started on John of the Cross and on Exaltation and on John of the Cross. It's like all these auspicious dates that you want to be perfect, right? So I share that with Thérèse, that sentiment, but that idea that, okay, you know, God works beyond just those providential sort of nice I don't want to say coincidences, but those sort of how things line up in ways that are you know, cute and nice, right?
So when does Thérèse get permission then to enter?
Well, it's New Year's Day, so it's a week after Christmas, the octave.
But she doesn't enter right away.
Right. Well, so there's obviously, you know, you can't tell, like, get the letter and enter tomorrow. So there's a date set, but then we know that Thérèse's oldest sister Marie was of all of her family members was probably the most sort of hesitant of Thérèse to enter, but it's Pauline actually who works to delay Thérèse's entry. She's worried that the Lenten penances will be too much for Thérèse, which I'm sure would have really annoyed Thérèse when she found that out. And it really annoyed Louis. Louis was really taken aback. I mentioned this last week, but he goes into the speak room and basically accuses Pauline, Sister Agnes, of being sort of this, you know, sort of letting down what her word was in the sense of, you know, you promise and then you take it back, sort of thing. But I think for Thérèse, it's you know, at this point she knows that she's going to enter, and so you know, ultimately she does at the end of, what is it,
April 9th.
April, yeah. So.
Yeah. But it still is, it's funny to me reading this because she finds out she has to wait another 3 months, and you'd think it's an eternity. She's just like, it's so hard for her, but we can see how providential it was and how that time, and she was able to see looking back, and when she writes about it in the Story of a Soul, of how providential it was and how God was really using those 3 months to prepare her for her entrance into Carmel.
Yeah, exactly. And even the whole thing, it might have been very wise, because remember, Thérèse was so sensitive to the cold, and that ended up becoming like the hardest thing for her, later on in Carmel. And so, to enter right away and just be subjected to that, it could have been, I'm sure she would have persevered, but just again, like God's providence, that might have been the right moment. And so many things happened in those 3 months, that she kind of recognized too. She had the wisdom to say, no, I'm going to use this time well and do as best I can. And so she didn't pretend to be a nun for those 3 months. But she did, you mentioned earlier about just doing all those little things, I don't know if it'd be worth maybe quoting even, because mortifying the will, not letting any word pass, like a sharp word, or not giving in to her wants every time, or those kind of things that for a 14, 15-year-old, would be quite challenging, but saying, no, I'm going to use this time well and try to interiorly kind of bring my will under subjection. And so then, therefore, when I enter Carmel, it'll be much more natural.
Yeah, so then we get the dates coming, right? April 9th is 1888 is when she entered. And she writes in the Story of a Soul about the night before she entered and having dinner with the whole family, and just how, even though she's looked forward to this day so much, everyone's kind of filled with tears, and saying goodbye to her. But yet she's even, she just experiences this great peace when the day finally comes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. My favorite, Thérèse didn't know about this. This comes from a later account, probably from Pauline, but the superior, the priest superior of the Carmel, he kind of throws a biting sort of remark when he says, well, I hope she doesn't disappoint you.
You got what you want.
Yeah. So this sort of sarcastic little remark that I'm sure annoyed Pauline to a great degree. I mean, she remembers it pretty. I think it's Pauline that remembers this, but it's doesn't really faze Thérèse at all. We don't know if she overheard this remark, but even to the end. I mean, well, even to the point of Thérèse's entry into Carmel, there was still sort of like this hesitation, right? Yeah. It's like, okay, here we go again, another young girl who's not ready, so to speak. But her first months in Carmel are filled with great peace and joy and being able to live everything that she'd already been living outside of the cloister.
Exactly. And I think that's one of the key, and a good thing for anyone who's discerning, is that Thérèse said, when I entered, I mean, it was not all roses, because, right away too, they were going to make sure she's not just going to be the spoiled girl in the convent or something. And so the Spirit was kind of hard on her, and she said, but nothing surprised me. Like there was nothing that I met in Carmel that shocked me or made me think anything different than when I entered. And I think that's the key, is just being realistic, that when we're discerning a vocation, to not have a sense that everything's going to be different or finally I'll just get this or be this way. It's like just to be very realistic about what you're entering, but still desiring that with all your heart, And the last thing I would just say too with that, is when I was discerning and going through the application process, and there were some challenges that came up, and a Carmelite nun told me, if you don't have difficulties in your application process, you should probably doubt your vocation to Carmel. So I think, and just for people to see that too, that she can be a real patron, for that, these difficulties.
And we see also in Thérèse this sense of acknowledging God's providence and God's will, even in the setbacks. Seeing, even if it's not in discernment, but just in the daily things in our lives, how the struggles, the things that we see as setbacks are really God's way of teaching us God's way of helping us, preparing us for what is to come. And so that helps when we're in those moments to kind of recognize that, no, this is happening for a reason. There's God's using this to sanctify me.
Mm-hmm.
So with that, we'll come back next week and continue our journey with Saint Thérèse and her life and her lessons and the beginning of her discovery, in a sense, of the little way. And what that meant for her and how she spread that to the other nuns she lived with and ultimately to the whole world. Her little way that was so influential in her becoming a saint and also a doctor of the church, the youngest doctor of the church. So with that, we wish you a blessed Lent this week. Stay determined in that. Ask for graces through the intercession of Saint Thérèse. God bless you.
God bless.
Bye.
Hey everyone, Brother Pier Giorgio here. Thanks for checking out this episode of CarmelCast. If you want to hear more of us, don't forget to click subscribe. Also, be sure to click like if you enjoyed this episode, and maybe even leave us a comment. We post discussion questions down below to get the conversation going. Want more information on Carmelite spirituality and the Discalced Carmelite saints? Then you'll want to check out our website, www.icspublications.org. There's a link in the description of this episode. From here, you can see all our current promotions and access our complete catalog for the writings of St. John of the Cross, St. Teresa of Avila, St. Thérèse of Lisieux, St. Elizabeth of the Trinity, and St. Edith Stein. If you want to stay up to date on all our promotions and new titles, then be sure to add your email to our email list. There's no better way to stay up to date on the latest Carmelite publications. Thanks for joining us, and may God bless you.